The water hit her like a wall of ice, and for a split second, Evelyn Carter forgot how to breathe. Not because of the cold, though it was cold, colder than she'd expected this far south, but because her brain couldn't process what had just happened. One moment she'd been standing on the deck of her own boat, squinting against the morning sun, listening to her daughter complain about money and inheritance and all the ways Evelyn had apparently failed her. The next, she was underwater, salt burning her eyes, lungs screaming, arms flailing in the dark blue nothing that seemed to pull her down with fingers she couldn't see. She kicked hard, her legs pumping against the weight of her soaked jeans and the panic rising in her chest like a fist closing around her ribs. Her head broke the surface and she gasped, choking on seawater in confusion, her hair plastered across her face in thick ropes that stuck to her cheeks and mouth. Her clothes were heavy, so impossibly heavy, dragging at her shoulders and hips like they wanted to pull her back down to where the light didn't reach and the pressure crushed everything into silence. She spun in the water, disoriented, her arms cutting wide arcs through the surface as she searched for the boat, for Marissa, for something that made sense in a world that had suddenly stopped making any sense at all. And there it was, maybe 20 feet away, the white hole gleaming in the morning sun like it was mocking her. Marissa stood at the rail, one hand resting casually on the throttle, the other hanging loose at her side, and she was watching her mother with an expression that Evelyn couldn't quite read from this distance but could feel in her bones, cold, detached, like she was observing something mildly interesting happening to someone who didn't really matter. Their eyes met across the water, and Evelyn opened her mouth to call out, to ask what the hell was happening, to beg her daughter to throw her a line or explain the joke or do literally anything that would make this nightmare stop being real. But before she could speak, before she could form the words that were tangled somewhere between her brain and her throat, Marissa smiled. It wasn't a big smile, nothing dramatic or theatrical, just a slight curve at the corner of her mouth that made Evelyn's blood run colder than the ocean already was. Then she said it, her voice carrying across the water with perfect clarity, calm and clear and almost pleasant, like she was commenting on the weather or reminding her mother to pick up milk on the way home. Say hello to the sharks. The engine roared to life with a sound that shattered the morning quiet, and the boat lurched forward, bow lifting as the propeller bit into the water and churned it into white foam that sprayed sideways in twin arcs. Evelyn screamed, a raw animal sound that tore out of her throat and echoed across the empty ocean. Her daughter's name stretched into something that didn't even sound like language anymore. She thrashed forward, arms cutting through the water in desperate strokes, trying to close the gap, trying to reach the boat before it was too late, even though some part of her already knew it was too late, had been too late the moment Marissa's hands hit her shoulders and pushed. The distance grew with cruel efficiency, 10 feet becoming 20, 20 becoming 50, the white hole getting smaller and smaller until it was just a dot dancing on the horizon, and the sound of the engine faded from a roar to a hum to a whisper to nothing at all. Evelyn stopped swimming because there was no point anymore, no point in wasting energy chasing something that was already gone, and she treaded water instead, her chest heaving with exertion and terror, watching the boat shrink into nothingness, watching her daughter leave her to die in the middle of an ocean that suddenly felt larger than the entire world. The silence that followed was worse than the cold, worse than the fear, worse than the shock of the water or the betrayal or the realization that her own daughter had just tried to murder her. It was the kind of silence that swallowed everything, that pressed against her eardrums and made her feel like she'd gone deaf or died already, and this was just the waiting room before whatever came next. No gulls crying overhead, no other boats cutting through the distance, no distant hum of a coastline or the sound of waves breaking on sand. Just water, miles and miles of it. Dark beneath her feet where she couldn't see what might be rising up from the depths, endless around her in every direction like the ocean had decided to erase everything else from existence and leave her floating alone in the middle of nowhere with nothing but her thoughts and the growing certainty that she was going to die out here. She turned in a slow circle, her arms moving in lazy strokes to keep herself afloat while she searched for land, for help, for anything that might save her from the situation her daughter had thrown her into. Nothing greeted her but more water, the surface broken only by the occasional swell that lifted her up like a giant hand and set her back down just as gently, reminding her how small she was, how insignificant, how easy it would be for the ocean to simply forget she existed. Her mind raced through possibilities and explanations and desperate plans, trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to find the logic in a moment that felt like it had shattered every assumption she'd ever made about her life and the people in it. This couldn't be real, some part of her insisted, because Marissa was angry and entitled and difficult, but she wasn't a murderer, wasn't capable of looking her own mother in the eye and condemning her to death with a smile and a joke about sharks. Except she was. And deep down in the part of herself that Evelyn had been carefully ignoring for years, she'd always known that Marissa was capable of exactly this kind of cruelty, had seen the signs building like storm clouds on a horizon she'd refused to look at directly. The water pressed against her from all sides like it had weight and intention, like it wanted to squeeze the air out of her lungs and replace it with salt and darkness and the kind of silence that came before drowning. Evelyn's arms moved automatically, muscle memory from 3 decades of research dives taking over when her conscious mind was still trying to catch up with the fact that her daughter had just shoved her into the ocean and left her there to die. She kicked toward the surface again, broke through, gasped, and this time when the air hit her lungs she forced herself to slow down, to breathe through her nose, to stop the hyperventilation that would burn through her energy and leave her exhausted and sinking within the hour. Her vest was still on, the lightweight fishing vest with a waterproof pocket where she kept her phone and her emergency whistle and the small dive knife she'd carried since her 20s. Her fingers fumbled with the zipper, numb and clumsy from the cold, but she got it open and felt inside, hoping against hope that something useful had survived the fall. The phone was dead, waterlogged despite the supposedly waterproof case, the screen black and unresponsive when she pressed the button. The whistle was there though, plastic and bright orange, and she pulled it out and blew hard, the shrill sound cutting across the empty water like a scream that went nowhere and died in the air. She stopped blowing after the 3rd attempt because there was nobody to hear it, nobody for miles in any direction, and all she was doing was wasting breath she couldn't afford to waste. Her mind shifted gears, moving from panic into the cold analytical space she'd learned to inhabit during emergencies at sea, during equipment failures and unexpected currents, and that one time off the coast of Belize when her dive partner had run out of air at 60 feet and she'd had to butter breathe them both to the surface. She assessed her situation with the detached precision of someone cataloging data for a report. Water temperature probably 68 degrees, survivable for several hours if she could manage the exhaustion and avoid heat loss. No immediate signs of injury beyond bruising on her shoulders where Marissa's hands had connected. Visibility good, which meant she could see threats coming but also meant there was nowhere to hide. Distance to shore estimated at 5 miles minimum, too far to swim in street clothes with no support. Above her somewhere, invisible now beyond the curve of the horizon, Marissa was probably already composing her story, deciding what to tell the Coast Guard when they asked where her mother had gone, practicing the tears and the shock and the grief of a daughter who'd just lost everything. The research vessel that found her 6 hours later was crewed by marine biology students from the university where Evelyn had taught before retiring. And when they hauled her aboard wrapped in emergency blankets and shaking so hard her teeth clattered, she made them promise not to report it. Not yet. Not until she understood what was happening and why. They took her to a private dock, called a doctor who owed Evelyn favors from a decade ago, and kept her disappearance off every official channel while she recovered from hypothermia and exhaustion in a spare room that smelled like diesel fuel and old coffee. Meanwhile, on shore, Marissa was performing the role of her lifetime. She called the Coast Guard within an hour of leaving Evelyn in the water, her voice breaking perfectly as she explained how her mother had been standing too close to the rail, how a wave had come from nowhere, how she tried to turn the boat around but couldn't find her, couldn't see her, couldn't save her. The search lasted 3 days, helicopters and boats combing the area where Marissa claimed it happened, which was conveniently 2 miles east of where she'd actually pushed her mother overboard, ensuring they'd find nothing but empty water and disappointed hope. The vigil was Marissa's idea, held on the beach at sunset with candles and flowers and a poster-sized photo of Evelyn in her wetsuit holding a clipboard, looking every inch the dedicated scientist and loving mother. Marissa stood at the center of it all, mascara running artfully down her cheeks, accepting hugs from people who'd known Evelyn for years, people who had no idea they were comforting a murderer. She gave interviews to local news stations, her voice trembling as she talked about her mother's passion for the ocean, how fitting it was that the sea had taken her in the end, how Evelyn would have wanted everyone to remember her work and her legacy and the love she had for her only daughter. Behind the scenes, though, away from the cameras and the sympathy cards and the casseroles that kept arriving at the house, Marissa was on the phone with lawyers, asking pointed questions about death certificates and presumed deceased status and how quickly she could access her mother's accounts. She scheduled meetings with the director of the Marine Research Foundation Evelyn had established, inquiring about grant money and operational funds and whether the board would consider dissolving the organization now that its founder was gone. Daniel Rourke had worked with Evelyn 15 years earlier on a lawsuit against a commercial fishing operation that was destroying coral reefs off the southern coast, and when she called him from a borrowed phone with a voice still raw from screaming in salt water, he didn't ask questions, just gave her an address and told her to come in through the back entrance. He listened to her story in his cramped office overlooking the harbor, his expression shifting from skepticism to horror to the cold professional focus of someone who'd just realized he was holding a case that would define his career. She forgot about the boat's systems, Evelyn said, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, steam rising between them like evidence of life. Every conversation we had was recorded on the onboard audio logger I installed last year after that insurance claim. Every location is tracked by GPS down to the minute. She pushed me off the boat at exactly 9:43 in the morning, and the boat didn't taint around, didn't slow down, didn't deviate from its course back to shore for even a second. Daniel pulled up maritime law on his computer, scrolling through statutes and precedents while Evelyn explained the rest. How she documented everything in her research journals, how the boat's maintenance records would show she'd serviced the recording system just 2 weeks before, how Marissa's fingerprints would be on the throttle and the rail and probably on Evelyn's shoulders if they looked hard enough. They built the case methodically over the next 3 weeks, pulling boat records and audio files and GPS logs, creating a timeline so airtight that no defense attorney in the world could squeeze out through the cracks. Evelyn didn't want revenge. She told Daniel more than once, didn't want to see her daughter rot in prison out of spite or maternal disappointment. What she wanted was the truth on record, permanent and undeniable, the kind of truth that couldn't be performed away or cried away or explained away with stories about ways and accidents and loving mothers who tragically slipped. She wanted Marissa to face what she'd done in a room where grief couldn't be used as a shield, where the performance had to end because the evidence wouldn't let it continue. The message came through Marissa's lawyer, formal and bureaucratic, explaining that final estate paperwork required a signature and presence at the old harbor house where Evelyn had kept her research office for 20 years. Marissa arrived on a Thursday afternoon, her hair perfect, her outfit carefully chosen to suggest tasteful mourning without looking like she was trying too hard. She'd rehearsed this moment, the way she'd rehearsed everything since the boat, practicing the expression she'd wear when she signed the documents that would transfer everything her mother had owned into her name. She walked through the house like she already owned it, running her fingers along the bookshelves packed with marine biology texts and field journals, imagining what each room would look like after she renovated, after she erased every trace of her mother's work and turned this place into something modern and profitable. The lawyer was waiting in the study, a slim man with gray hair and reading glasses, and he gestured for her to sit, sliding papers across the desk that Marissa barely glanced at because she was too busy thinking about how much the house would sell for, how much freedom that money would buy. Just a few questions before we finalize everything, the lawyer said, his voice neutral and professional. Standard procedure for cases involving presumed death. You were with your mother on the boat that day, correct? Can you walk me through what happened one more time? Marissa launched into her story, polished and confident, never once asking how her mother had died because she already knew, had known from the moment her hands connected with Evelyn's shoulders and sent her tumbling backward into the water. The door opened and Evelyn stepped into the room, alive and solid and wearing the same expression she used to wear when Marissa was 16 and had been caught lying about where she'd been all night. Marissa's face went white, then gray, her mouth opening and closing like she was the one drowning now, like the air had been sucked out of the room and replaced with something she couldn't breathe. She stood up so fast her chair tipped backward and hit the floor with a crack that echoed off the walls. Before she could speak, before she could ask how or why or scramble for an explanation that would make this make sense, Daniel pressed a button on his laptop and Marissa's own voice filled the room, tinny but clear from the boat's audio recorder. Say hello to the sharks. Then laughter, cold and bright, followed by the engine roaring to life and Marissa talking to herself about how easy it had been, how her mother had looked so surprised, how nobody would ever know. The GPS data appeared on a screen behind Evelyn, a map with timestamps and coordinates, showing exactly where the boat had been, exactly where it had turned around, exactly how long Marissa had waited before calling for help. The timeline collapsed like a house of cards, each piece of evidence stacking on top of the last until there was no air left between the lies. Police officers stepped through the door Evelyn had just entered, their presence turning the room from a meeting into an arrest. Marissa tried to cry, tried to explain, tried to shift blame to stress and grief and the unfairness of a mother who never understood her. But none of it worked because the recording kept playing, her own voice condemning her with words she couldn't take back. 6 months after the trial ended with a guilty verdict and a sentence that would keep Marissa locked away for the next 15 years minimum, Evelyn sold the Harbor House to a young couple who promised to maintain the research library and the dock where she'd launched 1,000 expeditions into waters that had tried to kill her and failed. The money went into a foundation she established for marine safety education and survivor support, programs that would teach people what to do when the ocean tried to take them, when family tried to destroy them, when the world insisted they should have died but they chose to live anyway. She bought a smaller boat, nothing fancy, just enough to get her back out on the water where she belonged, and on clear mornings she'd motor past the spot where Marissa had pushed her overboard and feel nothing but gratitude for the strength that had carried her through those hours in the water, the clarity that had helped her survive, the certainty that truth was always stronger than performance. She didn't forgive her daughter because forgiveness wasn't the point, wasn't what the story needed. What mattered was that she'd reclaimed her life, her work, her ocean, and turned a moment of betrayal into proof that some things couldn't be drowned, no matter how hard someone tried.